Darian Fenton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, it is an absolute privilege to take a call on the Civil Aviation Cape Town Convention and Other Matters Amendment Bill 2010 or 2010, and I've been waiting with bated breath and great anticipation to take a call on this bill because it's such a riveting and exciting bill. But you know, I don't want to belittle the bill because I know it's important. And as other members have said, the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee did do an examination of the treaty and reported back to the House 4 or 5 weeks ago. And I want to thank very much the officials who came and took us through this convention. It was a very interesting experience, can I say. And I think they did their very, very best to try to get us to try and make it interesting for the members of the committee. And I do genuinely thank them for that. And I also want to say that the national interest analysis that's attached to the report from the Transport and Industrial Relations Committee on the treaty examination is very, very thorough. And perhaps if we have a little chance later on in the committee stages, Mr Speaker, I may talk about some of the advantages, but also there are some disadvantages as explained to us by the officials, which are worth, I think, considering. Having said that, Labour is supporting this bill because it's pretty uncontroversial. It amends domestic legislation so that New Zealand can be party to an international convention on aircraft ownership. Now, Mr Speaker, I can't help myself with this one because here we are with a convention. And I'm aware that New Zealand tries to be a good global citizen and participate in global agreements and play a leadership role in that. And so it does, the question comes up again for me, why we can support this convention, but not a convention on fundamental rights for domestic workers, which our government voted against at the International Labour Organisation 2 weeks ago. And they voted along countries like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Iran and Kuwait. And that was to prevent an international standard that would provide protection to domestic workers throughout the world, but also in New Zealand. And I'm not sure, I haven't had an explanation about why our country voted in opposition to countries like the USA, Australia, the UK and the Philippines. And I think it's very damaging to our reputation. So, as I said, while I'm pleased that we are supporting this across the House, I'm still very, very concerned about our position, especially when a former National Party MP, Marilyn Waring, has offered an apology to the women of the Commonwealth for New Zealand's vote against the proposed ILO convention, saying that New Zealanders are ashamed, saddened and outraged that the principles which we hold dear and try to live by have been abrogated by our government, the Government of New Zealand. And despite what the Minister says, this is a convention that would have affected New Zealand workers. There are around 20,000 home-based care workers in New Zealand and thousands more throughout the world. So, you know, we talk in this debate about developing countries and how this convention will help them, but we don't care about the thousands of domestic workers throughout the world that have that have no rights. And an overwhelming majority of New Zealand domestic workers are very poorly paid, and they're excluded from the discrimination provisions of the Human Rights Act. So while we support this convention, as I said, it came to my attention when I was thinking about this, why we can do this in this House, across the House and agree on it, yet we have a situation at the ILO where New Zealand has had a good reputation, particularly under the past government, and that is slowly being eroded. Now, as other members have mentioned, Mr Speaker, there are also amendments to the Civil Aviation Act in this bill, and that's to introduce more flexibility into civil aviation rulemaking. Now, I wanted to make a couple of comments here about air safety. I think the Minister's... No, he may not be here, but perhaps later I can ask him some questions. I want to say that the Civil Aviation Authority does a good job, given their paucity of funding and the challenges of regulating what is a very wide-ranging aircraft operation, New Zealand commercial and recreation operations. However, an issue that came up recently was around Queenstown Airport, and we wrote to the Civil Aviation Authority asking about safety issues at Queenstown Airport. It is a difficult airport, and there have been media reports about a lack of experience in the control tower and an increasing number of safety incidents. Associate Transport Minister Nathan Guy will be pleased to know that Airways New Zealand wrote back to us on behalf of the Civil Aviation Authority with assurances that staffing and training levels are more than adequate for this particular airport. Well, that's all well and good, but what happened last week? 2 pilots apparently used their airside security passes to sneak onto the Queenstown Airport runway in the middle of the night to race a car. Now, the boy racer legislation didn't apply to them, obviously. But needless to say, these pilots put the lives of others at risk with this action, and they ended up being banned from all airport land for 2 years. Now, OK, that's the right outcome. So the authority that Mr Guy is responsible for has provided us with perfectly reasonable answers to our valid concerns, Mr Speaker. But I have to say that these perfectly reasonable answers have not prevented a couple of cowboy pilots from playing drag racing on their airstrip at Queenstown. And I would encourage the Minister to be more vigilant about these sorts of things, because we can't have these sorts of security concerns happening in our airport. And while I'm also another issue on civil aviation, there was a recent announcement from the Associate Minister around monitoring of commercial pilots on drug and alcohol issues. Now, the 2 things: the CAA is going to work with the Ministry of Justice to introduce random checks on commercial pilots for any criminal convictions which have not been declared. And secondly, they're going to introduce an electronic database which will enable them to more effectively gather information and monitor any trends. And Mr Speaker, Labor supports these initiatives, and I really want to say we don't believe there's any room for drug and alcohol use among pilots, although I do have to reflect that Air New Zealand has had monitoring systems in place for many years, and they were quite aggrieved about the suggestion that they hadn't. In actual fact, the problem is in small aircraft and small commercial airlines. And so it seemed like Mr Guy was being pretty proactive around his press release in April, but what it didn't say was that the CAA had repeatedly being asked for more powers to identify pilots with drinking problems, but unfortunately the Minister had been sitting on his hands. The press in Christchurch obtained a briefing to the Minister under the Official Information Act, written just a month earlier. It states that the existing system is heavily dependent on individuals acting responsibly and self-disclosing information relating to their drug and alcohol use. But it also shows that the CAA had proposed a series of measures, including limits for drug and alcohol use, but nothing had been done. So, Mr Speaker, as you can see, while we support this convention, there are some concerns, and if I had more time, there are many more, and perhaps I'll get into those in the second and third reading. Many concerns around civil aviation, the things that we need to be doing in New Zealand, the things that we need to be doing to ensure the safety of people who fly in New Zealand, and also, of course, meeting our international obligations, making it easier for our airline industry, making it easier for them to operate internationally and to meet our obligations to other countries. Thank you.